It's a joy to be with you today to talk about something important to all of us, inclusion. The past 2 years have been hard for everyone, and it's more important now than ever that we take care of each other and nurture the friendships that make belonging to Rotary so unique. What would happen if we demonstrated true inclusion by acknowledging how difficult the past years have been and asking how we, your Rotary community, can help? Together, as leaders, we've taken steps to strengthen our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and this is an important step for our organization. Today, I want us to address how we can make Rotary a more welcoming place for our current and for our future members. We are all the faces and the voices of Rotary. We are the faces that people see when they look to join our clubs or to join in service. If they see the commitment in our actions, it strengthens our entire organization. I want to take you on a journey today. Imagine how someone would feel if they attended a meeting and knew nothing about Rotary. Then start asking yourself some questions. Would this person feel welcomed? Would members try to get to know them in an authentic way? Or would they get some small talk and the Rotary sales pitch? Would someone follow up with them and try to understand what they're looking for, and then try to connect them with the parts of Rotary that would meet their needs? Would they see themselves reflected in our clubs and recognize others that shared their backgrounds and experiences? These are the kind of questions we need to be asking ourselves. They get to the heart of how welcoming our clubs are and what steps we need to take to become more appealing to prospective members. Every journey starts with a single step. Our first step is examining where we are. And a good way to assess where you are is by asking the members of your club about their experience, then making changes based on the feedback, and then asking them again and again. Make open and honest feedback central to your club's culture. Diversity has been one of Rotary's core values for a very long time. We haven't always got it right, but this isn't an exercise in casting blame. It's about being honest with ourselves, about where we are in the journey and where we want to go. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is not a political issue. We all have the right to be treated with dignity and respect, and we all have the right to equal opportunities for fellowship and service, and to be given the same platforms for our voices to be heard. It's important to recognize and understand that we're all at different stages of this journey and our understanding of DEI. That's okay, and that's why it's important to have leaders who are passionate and knowledgeable and willing to share their expertise about what's going to take us further ahead. Every club should seek out these leaders. They should be a diverse group that's representative of your community. But keep in mind that members of underrepresented groups may not want to be part of these groups. No one should be expected to single-handedly change our culture. That's a job for all of us. Imagine Rotary. If we take small steps in the same direction, we will reflect what current and future members expect and want from their Rotary experience: respect, ethical leadership, inclusion, and the opportunity to work together to create more open and welcoming communities for all people. Imagine DEI. During the 2022-23 Rotary year, I call on all of us to increase our understanding of DEI and share our knowledge with our families, peers, and community. We also need to define why it matters to our clubs and how we can make Rotary a more welcoming, inclusive, and inspiring place for everyone who engages with us. And lastly, we need to take action in ourselves, in our communities, and in our clubs. I'm so excited to see the ways that we can all live up to our renewed commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Today, I thank you for your leadership.
Good evening, fellow Rotarians, and welcome to the final virtual breakout of our Zone Impact Summit. My name is Marcy Ullum, and I've served as the program chair for our Zone Summit and these virtual breakouts. Our topic tonight is on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And let's start with an example. If you were visually impaired, this is how you would see me, a blank screen with a voice. So if I wanted to actively include you in the discussion, it might be helpful to describe myself. I am a white woman with freckles, with long blonde or, let's just admit it, gray hair, and I have glasses. I wear glasses. I'm originally from the middle of the US, so you might detect a fairly flat accent. And tonight, I'm wearing a forest green long sleeve top with my Imagine Rotary pen. My Zoom background is what we used for our Baltimore summit with an aqua background, the Rotary logo in the upper left-hand side, and a small red crab. We nicknamed him Sheldon off to the right. Now, many of you know me, so other than what I'm wearing, you could picture me in your mind's eye. But if you've never seen me, this might be helpful to create an image of at least what I look like this evening. This is only one of the points we're going to underscore in our discussion. I'm pleased to introduce our host for this evening's discussion, Valarie Wafer. Valarie joined Rotary in 2005 and has served as district governor and on the Rotary Board of Directors, as well as many other roles at the international level, last year serving as our Rotary International Vice President. Charged with leading the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Task Force, she and her task force members have made great strides in creating a DEI statement and encouraging dialogue and discussion at every level to examine our thinking about those that are different from us and to challenge our unconscious biases that might be preventing us as Rotarians, as Rotary Clubs, and Rotary International from truly representing our communities and being the best organization we can. Please join me in giving Valarie a warm Rotary welcome.
Thanks, Marcy. And I'll follow Marcy's lead and give a visual description of myself as well. I'm a white woman of average height and build, or at least I like to think so. I have blue eyes and a short haircut, and my hair is white. I'm wearing a black blazer with a white shirt, and my Zoom background is blue with the Rotary symbol in the upper corner. I'm very excited about tonight's discussion as we take a bit of a different tact in the ongoing DEI discussion. Often when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, the conversation revolves around gender, race, or sexual orientation. But there are many varied kinds of different, and we're going to explore some of those this evening. What I and the panel want, however, is for you to listen to their stories and think about your own stereotypes or beliefs that might cause you to treat or interact with an individual with a physical disability or a mental impairment differently. Do you jump to conclusions about what they can or cannot do? Do you make assumptions about what they want or need? Are you able to see them for who they are as individuals and not just the label that society might apply? Our three panelists are experienced in the disability world because they live it every day. They are well aware of how they and those like them are or might be perceived. With a wealth of experience and knowledge, individuals who have disabilities are underemployed, underutilized, and undervalued. Today's panel discussion will focus on accessibility and inclusion. So please put all your questions in all cap in the chat box and we'll address them at the end. Do you have a question you've always wanted to ask, but felt it wouldn't be appropriate? Well, in the words of our panelists, they told me, bring it on. This is your opportunity to learn. All we ask is that you're respectful and open to different views. Now, last year, Rotary International and the DEI Task Force invited you to participate in a survey to help us learn how diversity, equity, and inclusion is perceived and experienced by Rotary members around the globe. So thank you for helping Rotary take an important step towards becoming an organization that better embraces the needs and experiences of, and that better offers opportunities to all of our members and participants. And we were thrilled that so many of you, more than 31,000 members representing clubs all over the world, shared your thoughts and experiences by participating in the survey. And overwhelmingly, you told us that DEI is important to you and that you have a strong desire to make Rotary's culture more diverse, equitable, and inclusive. And we listened to our members, and your responses and feedback helped shape our roadmap for the journey ahead. I want to share that a key theme that emerged was that access to leadership and membership positions were limited to so-called traditional members. And there's an indication of exclusionary practice that's at play, preventing some from holding leadership positions. The feedback indicated a common perception that Rotary is not inclusive to members with a disability. There was a common sentiment by 48% of respondents who indicated that Rotary members with a physical or mental disability cannot hold a leadership position. Additionally, 33% said they would not recommend Rotary to a person with a disability. Well, today, we have the opportunity to change those attitudes and statistics. And I want to now turn to our panelists and ask each of them to introduce themselves. So we'll start with Jeremy.
Thank you, Valarie, and good evening to everybody. Here I am Jeremy Opperman. I am a South African. I live in Cape Town. I represent the Rotary Club of Newlands in District 9350. I present, or I present as blind, identify as blind, so I don't see. I did start my life out 59 years ago with partial vision, and it's just deteriorated over the years to the point where I have almost no usable vision, just light and dark. So describing myself could be tricky because frankly, I haven't the foggiest idea. But I'm white and I have pretty much gray hair, I suspect by now, and I've lost a hell of a lot of it in the front. And I'm wearing a shirt, and I honestly forgot to ask my wife what it looked like. Actually, couldn't tell you, but that's me. So I began work in the training industry, spent 10 years in training, not doing training, but marketing and sales. And then in 1999, I pivoted into the diversity and equity and inclusion space, specializing in disability. And I spent the last 23 years doing exactly that, working with corporates, particularly NGOs and state organizations, to find ways of including persons with disabilities, not just as employees, but as consumers as well. I worked for 5 years for our province in that time, running the disability desk as a project, and I'm back at consulting now. I joined Rotary exactly 2 years ago, and I've been on the DEI task force for the last year and a half. And I think that's me, Valarie. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Ali, let's turn to you. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, yes, my name is Ali Ingersoll. I am not a Rotarian. Yes, I am a white female with blonde, long hair. I have a blue sweater on with a background of my office and big, funky, I would say, off-white earrings. And I am in a power wheelchair. I am actually a C6 quadriplegic. I was injured in a shallow water diving accident at 27 in 2010. I am a disability strategy consultant, a day trader, speaker, and writer, and health insurance advocate. I started my advocacy career fighting health insurance companies for medically necessary equipment. I needed to not only survive in life, but to thrive, and I took that mission nationally and globally, and working with organizations, NGOs, and corporations to really help people with disabilities get the medication, prescriptions, equipment they need to not only survive in life, but to thrive and gain meaningful employment. On my consulting role, I now work with organizations and NGOs on helping them really flesh out robust disability DEI strategies and roadmaps and how to become more inclusive, from working with ERGs up to C-suite leaders. And I also work with organizations on making experiences more inclusive from in the physical and digital space. My passions are really helping human beings. So I have two philosophies in life: paying it forward and human kindness. So leaving my professional life aside, I dedicate about 15 hours a week just to advocacy and helping to make the world just a little bit more inclusive. And I think that sums up myself for the moment. Thank you, Valarie.
Wonderful, Ali. Thanks so much. And we'll turn to our last panelist, Mark.
Okay, good. Good evening, everybody. I'm delighted to be here with you today. I'm Mark Wafer, and I'm coming to you from Toronto, Canada. And I'm a member of the Rotary Club of Burlington North in District 7070. I'm a white man. I'm about 5'10" tall. I'm wearing a pink shirt. I wear 2 hearing aids. I have 2 hearing aids, and I have visible tattoos. I also have more hair than Jeremy Opperman. I was born deaf. I was born born with about 15% hearing. And today, I probably have a little bit less than that. I rely completely on lip reading or speech reading. And of course, we have closed captioning today, which is the only reason I'm able to follow you. Until recently, until about 5 years ago, Valarie and I owned a chain of restaurants in the city of Toronto. We actually had 14 restaurants, in which we were known as inclusive employers, and we can get to that in a little bit. Today, we're recognized globally as experts in the economics of inclusion. Today, I spend most of my time on DEI strategies, and I also chair 2 large nonprofit corporations that represent deaf people and Canadians with disabilities. I'm also a retired motorsports champion. So that's me. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, you can see that we've got some great experience and some big personalities with us tonight. So I think that the conversation is going to be very engaged. I think I'm going to have the toughest job just kind of corralling this conversation. So we appreciate each of you joining us today for this discussion, and let's get started. So how about we start off the first question? So how important is telling your story and being an advocate? Ali, let's start with you. You were recently crowned Miss Wheelchair America, a competition based on advocacy, achievement, and presentation for people with disabilities. A huge congratulations.
Thank you.
How has this changed your work? I know, as you mentioned, you fight the insurance industry, and I know you fought a very personal battle for your personalized wheelchair, which was vital for you to be independent. So do you think this new platform will bring further support and attention to your advocacy work?
Yes, thank you, Valarie. Absolutely. It was quite a surprise to be crowned Miss Wheelchair America. And I think my platform will really help spread the word and offer me a larger audience. But quite frankly, I've been fighting health insurance companies for the last 10 years. And I've done that through writing letters of medical necessity backed up by peer-reviewed journal articles and making the argument medical and working with individuals. But now the attention, one could say, from the media of Miss Wheelchair America for my health insurance advocacy has afforded me the opportunity to work with, I'm in Raleigh, North Carolina, the North Carolina State Medical Board, the state treasurer, working with our governor on different legislative initiatives to push forward on helping people with disabilities get the equipment specifically they need to literally just survive in a day: a wheelchair, a pressure relieving mattress, a shower chair, if you can believe that. And it all came about when I was fighting a personal battle for a seat elevator for my $35,000 wheelchair that I had to fight Blue Cross and Blue Shield for, button by button. And they denied it. And they said it was a non-covered benefit item. And I went through the entire appeals process for months, and I was getting nowhere. And I think I write pretty well, and I wrote a very strong argument. So I reached out to 57 investigative news reporters, of which 2 responded back to me. And I put the story out, and the investigative reporters actually reached out to Blue Cross and Blue Shield. And lo and behold, 48 hours later, I got an approval letter with the caveat saying this is not a precedent, which is unfortunate. Which is since after that in 2020, I joined a coalition called the Item Coalition, and we are working with CMS right now as we speak to reclassify seat elevators and standing power wheelchairs, which have a variety of medically necessary benefits, to get this reclassified with CMS, and hopefully we will have success in the next 6 months. So this platform with Miss Wheelchair America is affording me the opportunity to have meetings with higher ups and really have my voice heard to advocate on behalf of those with disabilities who just don't know how to become their own self-advocates yet, which is another driving mission I have.
Wow. You know, awards and recognition are so important for the work that we do, whether it's in Rotary or in the, you know, the work that we do personally. And so thank you for your advocacy, and thank you for, you know, putting your name forward for that competition so that you can elevate your voice. That's really, really important. Jeremy, let's move to you. You play an integral and valuable role as our newest member. You mentioned on the RIDEI task force, and professionally, you're a disability integration analyst. So you strive for natural and unhesitating integration of people with disabilities into mainstream society. Does DEI sufficiently cover the complexities of disability inclusion?
Well, to be honest, sadly, no, in my opinion. It's become very popular at the moment in the last few years, particularly in the last year and a bit. DEI has truly landed in the world, in the corporate world. And so a hell of a lot of work's being done in that area, but sadly, no. There is still a very strong tendency to overlook the disability element of DEI in a meaningful way, and spend a great deal of energy, particularly on race and gender issues, LGBT as well. And none of those are wrong. Those are good things to do. But unfortunately, there's a reason for this, is that disability has been largely invisible for millennia, actually. Invisible in the sense that people with disabilities have been rendered invisible by their lack of participation, their lack of inclusion. And so it's very difficult to suddenly force something like including disability meaningfully in the DEI narrative. But no, and that's a very serious thing. And so people like me spend a lot of energy highlighting the other D, lest it be forgotten, because actually there's actually quite a lot of bad habits that and bad practice that can come in through shoddy DEI initiatives, where disability is poorly transmitted in any way, or issues around disability inclusion are poorly transmitted. And so it's something that advocates like myself and Ali and Mark have to actually constantly raise our hand and remember and remind anybody who's playing in the DEI game that disability must be acknowledged properly. And that's quite hard work. And there's almost a sense of resentment sometimes when people say, oh yeah, but we are dealing with it. But sadly, there's a lot of work to be done. Having said that, the fact that DEI has gained such a footprint in the world, in corporate world particularly, means that we do in fact have a door to open. Sometimes it's not as successful as one would like. As I said before, there's often a resentment. But the fact is that DEI has landed, and it's our responsibility to make sure that disability doesn't get forgotten in that narrative.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you for the work that you do. If you haven't seen some of Jeremy's writings in either the Rotary magazine or on Rotary.org, I encourage you to look it up. Jeremy brings a wonderful perspective and sense of humor to all of his writings that are quite enjoyable. Let's move to Mark. Mark, you're a born storyteller, and if I can just share with everyone that your license plate on your vehicle actually says activist on it. But we know that legislation and policy won't change culture and the misperceptions around people with disabilities. So can you share with us what approach you take? What is critical to educating and changing mindsets?
Well, I think at first it's important to understand again how big this pool It's how big the community of disability is. It's 1 billion people in the world. So it's 1 in 5, almost 1 in 5. By the end of this decade, it's going to be 1 in 4. The potential spend of those individuals is $1 trillion US. If you add in the family members, it's $8 trillion US. So this is massive. This is a massive, massive pool of people. So it's important to understand that. I happened to grow up in a world that wasn't designed for me. And so that created the attitude that I have today, in which I describe myself as being a collaborative disruptor, And what I'd like to show you today is just how we came to change culture and educate and understand in the business world that being inclusive was actually not just the right thing to do, but it was good for a business and good for corporate Canada. And that is when we started our business back in the early 90s, we started to hire people with disabilities in real jobs for real pay. And it's quite by accident. And what happened is I understood the barriers that people with disabilities faced because I faced them myself. But I happened to, in the first week that we were in business, I happened to hire a young man with Down syndrome. And very quickly, he became my best employee. So we continued to hire people who had different types of intellectual disabilities. And they all became our best employees. But what we discovered over a period of time is by including people with disabilities in real jobs for real pay, what it did to our business is it reduced our absenteeism. It increased our safety ratings. It created a more innovative workplace, and it reduced our employee turnover. These are all things that were really expensive for business. And so we created what I call a business case or an economic case for inclusion. And why it was so important is because for decades, we used approaches to business that didn't work, charity-minded or legislative-minded, and they don't work. But if we could get business to understand that being an inclusive employer is good for your business, then they would open the doors and they would hire people in a capacity-driven way. And so when I say I'm a collaborative disruptor, I like to disrupt a little bit and make sure that businesses understand that if you do not hire people with disabilities today, you're actually losing out. You're losing out on that innovation, that different problem-solving skills. You're losing out on better profitability. That's not because people with disabilities are superstars. It's not the case. But the reality is, inclusion is good for your business. And that's the message that I always bring towards business when I'm speaking with them.
Great, thank you so much. Let's shift gears to our community and to Rotary. So let's talk a little bit about representation of people with disabilities in Rotary. Going back to our global DEI survey from last year, we asked participants if there was an option they could not answer the questions, but we asked them if they identified as a person with a disability. And 69% of people said no. And 28% chose not to answer the question. 1% said they preferred not to answer, and only 2.2% of respondents said yes. So Jeremy, what does this tell us? Are people with disabilities sufficiently represented in Rotary?
No, categorically not. But that's a starting point. So absolutely not. But that's not surprising, given where, I mean, I was just listening to that stat now, 2%. Now, it's not reflective in any way of the persons with disabilities, but in my country, that's more than all the people with disabilities employed. We employ less than 1% of our people with disabilities. And that's, in many developed countries, of course, the stat is much higher. So when it comes to an organization like Rotary, it's not surprising that you're going to see this. What's more important, though, is to understand why and how we can fix that and what we're going to do about it. But categorically, no. And there's a serious paradigm change needed. And paradigm changes are slow things. They're not quick. So you only have to think. I always use gender. I mean, I am a diversity practitioner, so I don't just talk disability. I have a very strong sense, I'm a feminist, I have a very strong sense of gender rights. And you only have to look at the struggle women had for the franchise, literally 100 years and change ago. And then think now where we're at. And yes, there's been progress, but it's been painfully slow, and there's still huge gaps. Now, if something like gender parity has been hard to achieve, then disability parity is going to be equally difficult. And that's why Rotary is at the moment deficit in terms of numbers. Now, because it's about attitude, and in a little later today or tonight, I'll unpack that in a broader sense of why. But I think what's very important, though, is Rotary has an unbelievably exciting challenge to make sure that we don't, in fact, stay as we are in the status quo of having so few people with disabilities, and do increase our numbers, because Rotary can't do anything about disability, but I do believe that having more people with disabilities can truly change the face of Rotary, which can only benefit the global disability world in the similar way that we saw how Rotary affected polio. I honestly believe that if we have a powerful inclusion mentality in Rotary going forward, and we can't expect it to be in a huge hurry, but if we have a consistent strategic approach and making sure we have inclusion, I think what you'll see is because Rotary is such a significant player, that we will see greater disability diversity in the world going forward.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you, Jeremy. Mark, you've explained the value of inclusion to business, real jobs for real pay. How then can that mindset benefit Rotary clubs around the world? What is the value of including people with disabilities in our clubs, and indeed in leadership roles as well?
Well, legislation and policy is important, but it doesn't change attitudes. Attitudes, however, and culture will change with representation, and representation matters always. Ali and Jeremy and I do everything different to you. Everything that we do in our day, from the moment we get out of bed in the morning, everything that we do is different to you. So that means we have different problem-solving skills. Not necessarily better, but different problem-solving skills. And that's how innovation is created. The innovation is not created in a Rotary Club simply by bringing in the smartest people we can find in our society. It's by bringing in regular folk, people like us, who problem solve in a different way. And that's how we create more innovative Rotary Clubs. Innovation in fundraising, innovation in membership. There's just so many ways in which we can improve our Rotary Club by having a policy of inclusion, including people with disabilities in not just Rotary membership, but in Rotary leadership as well. But there's another side to this. As your members in your Rotary Club age, they start to have accessibility problems themselves. Right? Quite often, Rotary clubs meet in church halls, or they meet in places that are not necessarily accessible. And it's okay when you're 60 or 65 and you can get up and down the stairs, but what happens 10, 15 years from now? You start to lose members. So member retention is also part of the inclusion discussion. Right? So it's a clear business case, especially when it comes to the innovation factor, a clear business case for including people with disabilities in Rotary, not just bringing them in the door and having them as members, but including them in every aspect of Rotary and our business and our leadership.
Thank you, Mark. Now, Ali, we were kind of noticing at the beginning that, we need to recruit you into Rotary because you're not a Rotarian currently, and we do have to fix that. But what advice would you give with respect to creating a more inclusive environment in our communities and in our Rotary clubs?
That's a great question. Actually, Mark took some of the words out of my mouth, as I was going to echo some of the same sentiments. But I think it's really important to understand with inclusion and accessibility, first and foremost, there is no one size fits all. From inclusive digital accessibility, physical accommodations, and working with people in the pan disability with different access needs. You have people with mobility impairments. You have the deaf and the blind, and you have chronic ailments, and you have the list goes on of the different type of disabilities. And there are also people that don't identify with a disability, that may have been born with their disability versus acquired it later in life. And making sure that the survey in the beginning that you alluded to, on 48% of respondents indicated that they cannot hold a leadership position, and 33% said they would not recommend a person with a disability to the club. That was a little bit surprising to me. And as Mark spoke about earlier, people with disabilities, many of us, we do things differently every day. Many of us are the most creative problem solvers, stay at jobs longer. We apply the kind of flexibility that's required for organizations to change really in these ever-changing times that we have. And it's needed for corporations, communities, organizations like the Rotary Club. The disability community, we comprise of 1/3 of the workforce in the United States, right? You need to really think about that. So the challenge is debunking the myth that disability is a disadvantage. For so long and for so many decades, especially from corporate leaders, directors, having a disability was seen as a disadvantage, and it's not. There's, as Mark mentioned, there's strong business cases, many papers out there saying from the bottom lines of companies and corporations, hiring people with disabilities is from a business imperative and good practice. But how do we do this? How do you change the DEI mindset, especially as it relates to disability? You do this through minimizing bias, increasing advocacy, accountability, access, and inclusion. Well, taking that a step further, how do you do that? Well, I don't know the statistics and how many surveys or how you've worked with Rotarians in the past, but I would wager that many people do not feel comfortable even disclosing their disability at this point. It has to come from you. It has to come from Rotarians. For those who didn't feel comfortable disclosing it, they need to feel welcome and they need to feel inclusive. And that involves the different local, national, and international Rotary Clubs, not just coming out with statements on diversity, equity, and inclusion, but actually working towards working with people with disabilities and putting out documents and statements and working with individuals and creating individual ERGs within the Disability Rotary Club. So, you are your own best advocate as well. So in order for the top down, you also have to have your Rotarians from the bottom up come up and speak up and not have that fear of not feeling included.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Ellie. And the percentages are alarming. But again, Rotary is starting out on this journey. And that was the very first time we launched our DEI survey. And so it really is going to act as a benchmark to see if people are more comfortable answering, identifying in the next round of the survey, which will be launched in March of 2023. So we're excited. We're excited to actually be able to see and quantify, some of those advances that we made, because
progress
it's
over
a lot of
perfection.
times. Exactly. So thank you so much. So this is the last question, but probably likely the most important. And I think a few of you have touched on some of the aspects, but there's perceived barriers to inviting new members with disabilities to our clubs or supporting our current members with disabilities. So let's talk about accessibility. And quite often we see that A being added to the acronym of diversity, equity, and inclusion. You've seen it shuffled around like IDEA. So accessibility is a big part. And when we have conversations about accessibility and inviting people with disabilities to our club meeting or to an event, it's so much more than just the physical building. If there's a ramp or if there's an elevator. And as been mentioned, each of you require an accommodation in your daily lives that are so different from each other, but yet have similarities in nature. So how can our Rotary Clubs and society become more accessible with the ultimate goal of inclusion, specifically for people with disabilities? Mark, let's start with you.
Okay, so when we were in business, and we had a Tim Hortons restaurant, and we would employ people who have disabilities, because we employed 250 workers over 25 years. We would use what we call ATP, ask the person. So when it came to accommodation, we didn't make up an accommodation and say, okay, we think this is what this person needs. We would actually ask them. We would say, what is it you need to be successful in your job? And that guaranteed success, not just for them, but for us as a business too. The same attitude of ATP should be used in a Rotary Club. So if Ali comes along in an electric wheelchair or Jeremy comes along with his white cane, the question to them should be, welcome to Rotary. What exactly can we do to make this successful for you? What do you need from an accommodation point of view? I've just started with a new Rotary Club because Valarie and I moved to a new city last year, the Rotary Club of Burlington North. And when I walked in, they already knew I was deaf because my partner was the vice president, so they knew who I was. And they said, what can we do, Mark, to make it easier for you? I can't hear. I can't hear what's going on in the Rotary Club. In fact, I'm completely lost. But we came up with a solution. We have hybrid meetings, and hybrid meetings have captioning. So if I'm at home, going to my Rotary meeting from home, I can turn on the captioning. But I can also do that if I'm actually at the Rotary meeting. So I take my laptop with me to the Rotary meeting, I dial in, log on to the hybrid part, to the online part, and I turn on the captioning, and I can hear everything that's going on in that meeting. In fact, it's better than we had before the pandemic, because now I can participate as much as anybody else in the room. But here's the interesting thing. I'm sitting at a table with 6 other people. And I notice after a little while, when people start to speak, everybody in that table is looking at my laptop. Everybody's looking at that laptop. Because some of them can't quite hear what's going on. Everybody starts to lose a little bit of hearing as they get older. All right, so I turn my laptop around so all 6 of us can look at the laptop and watch the captioning. All right, and so they can participate better. And so accommodations are adaptable. Accommodations are adaptable to non-disabled Rotarians. And you hear what I said about innovation before? That's innovation, innovative thinking. You've got people at my table who have never spoken up and say, I can't quite hear what's going on. But here was a solution for them. And when they saw that I was participating fully, now they thought, oh, this is good for them too.
And you know, Mark, I'll share another thing that's happened in Rotary in a club we used to belong to. They thought they were being accommodating to Mark because he couldn't hear. So the president thought, oh, we'll get a PA system and a microphone. And so she got a microphone and she held it right in front of her face while she was talking, and Mark couldn't read her lips. So without ATP or asking the person, we should never assume what an accommodation is needed for a person. So I'm sure you each have some comical and interesting stories from your past, but Ali, you describe yourself on LinkedIn as the Energizer Bunny on wheels, and that you consult to help people with disabilities live their rock star lives. What does accessibility mean to you, and how can we improve?
You know, Mark actually took some of the words out of my mouth again when he was saying about people watching his captions on his computer. That goes back to universal design. So there are a lot of products and services that were specifically designed for people with disabilities, but they've moved into the universal design, and the able-bodied population uses them just as much. So for me personally, aside from physical accommodations, of course, a ramp and a wheelchair, inclusive digital accessibility is huge, a cornerstone of my life, and allows me to live the way I do through interactions with social and professional networks, improvement of my quality of life, the ability to gain meaningful employment, the ability to have the Zoom meeting with you here, you know, and access to organizations, especially as it relates to the digital world. And we live in the digital world now. Now, you know, after COVID, it's going to be a hybrid world from now on, which is so important for so many of us with disabilities, because it allows us to really interact. And, you know, it allows us access to online education and healthcare and employment. But I think especially in an age of social media and online community networks, it means equal access to friendship and social growth, which is huge. Not to mention, it's just the moral and right thing to do. And if everyone does it, everyone wins, members in the organization to people with disabilities. But, you know, how do we really achieve this? Bottom line is data, right? As you mentioned, you're just starting out on your data journey and surveys, but this involves inclusive research, inclusive data. Data is the foundation for taking meaningful action. You simply can't measure what you can't see. Now, metrics don't exist to tell the whole story, of course, but they're a critical tool to help people understand how to prioritize what's important. But this really involves going out with your Rotarians and the pan disability community to understand the different access needs, as I alluded to earlier, asking questions, conducting surveys, having those conversations, as you mentioned, and not assuming you understand someone's access needs. What do you need, Allie? How can you help? You know, with my digital accessibility needs, I'm just as efficient and effective and fast on my computer as I was prior to my accident, because I'm paralyzed from the chest down with paralyzed hands and limited arm function. I just have a 3-screen setup. It looks like I have a little spaceship on my desk, but it really allows me to have a quality of life as well.
Great, thanks so much, Allie. Okay, last word to Jeremy. Can you expand on accessibility and how that impacts on disability inclusion?
Yep, sure. And I'm tempted to do it really quickly too, not because we're necessarily short of time, but because this is not rocket science. And here's the problem. Well, actually, it's not a problem. Here's the thing. I'll put it to you that there's no such thing as physical inaccessibility. Those buildings didn't build themselves. Those stadiums didn't build themselves. Those digital media platforms didn't make themselves. They were all designed by people. And so, as Ali says, the whole principle of universal design or inclusive design implies that you're creating something that will benefit everyone. The problem is that's back to my paradigm theory, is that we still, unfortunately, have a large grouping of people who are still stuck in the old paradigm, the old designers, the old architects, who haven't yet literally, I mean, you could make a joke of it and say you haven't come into the 21st century, but they certainly haven't landed in the paradigm, which we loosely call the social model, which essentially says that the disabilities themselves are certainly an issue, but it's the barriers that prevent us from doing stuff. Now, that concept, the three of us know intimately. You know, we can recite that easily and we can really live it and explain it easily. The trouble is not everybody's in that frame. And so as long as we have developers, I call them rather rudely, I call them millennial developers, youngsters who design digital platforms. And they didn't look back in the 90s at the kind of work that was done to incorporate screen readers and magnification software. And a lot of work was done in the 90s, actually, and in the early 2000s. But now a youngster comes along and he doesn't look back at the history. And he simply dig it, and he creates some new digital platform, completely overriding some of the access features that existed before, because it's not inculcated yet. I'll give you an example. So I live in a town where we have a large Muslim population. And if you were a corporate and you wanted to cater for a corporate function, and you didn't take halal, which is the halal means to cater for a Muslim person in their dietary, is very much like kosher. And if you didn't take halal into account, you'd be committing corporate suicide, because you wouldn't be able to cater for a large group of your constituency or your market share. And it's exactly the same with us, is that we haven't got to that point. And that's why I talk about an unhesitant and natural integration or inclusion of people with disabilities into mainstream society. We haven't yet got to that point of natural and unhesitant, because we still have too many people stuck in the past who haven't worked this one out yet. And so the greatest, to wrap what I'm saying up, the greatest barrier of all in inaccessibility is attitude. And if we can fix the attitudinal barrier, we will make huge steps towards creating accessible environments.
Thank you, Jeremy. I think that was a powerful statement to end the formal conversation that we've had with our panelists, who I think you'll all agree were outstanding and have given us so much to think about. So I want to thank Jeremy, Ali, and Mark. You know, each time we have these sessions, we hear unique perspectives and we each learn a little bit more. It's all about that honest, intentional, committed conversation. So I think I'm going to hand it back to Marcy, who's going to, I think I saw that the chat box was quite active. So Marcy, if you can give us some, questions, the panel is ready.
So we've got some great questions. A lot of people made comments. I think it's best if we save the chat and you can read through those. But let's start with the questions because there's a number. And some are specific. So Mark, the first one is for you. What do you attribute to the fact that disabled employees became your best employees?
Sure, it's a great question. Many of our employees with disabilities became our best employees, and there's many reasons for that. But the most important reason is that, and it's unfair, is that they have taken an incredible amount of time to get this job. The unemployment rate in developed nations for people with disabilities is well over 50%. It's 80% if you're deaf, it's 88% if you have autism. And so when someone does get a job, it could have taken years to get that job. And so the job is precious. It means so much to them. If it's a young man like the first gentleman that we hired who had Down syndrome, the job meant so much to him that he would actually wear his uniform to work. We would even allow people to wear their uniform to work because you contaminate it. You're on the subway, you're on buses, and then you're working with food. That's not a great idea. But he insisted because he wanted everybody on that bus to know he worked at Tim Hortons. It meant that much to him, all right? And so it's unfair that they have to prove themselves more than any other worker, but it's reality. The reality is that individuals with disabilities will be putting in a bigger effort, just like I did when I was a young man. When I was in my 20s, I worked twice as hard as everybody else did because I was just waiting for the boss to say, Mark can't do this because he's deaf, or Mark's screwing up because he's deaf, or Mark can't answer the phone because he's deaf. I'm always looking for that. And so it's something that is natural, that happens with people with disabilities. But when we look at it from a workforce point of view and how it benefits the employer, these are the things that we need to tell the employer and get the employer to understand that a inclusive workforce is a stronger workforce. And it does affect your P&L. It does positively affect your bottom line. It's so important to talk like that because otherwise businesses won't open their door and those unemployment rates will remain.
Thanks, Mark. Allie, the next is for you, a pretty specific question, but also I want to point out to you, I'll send this to you later. You've already been asked to be a speaker at a conference. I'll let you know.
Wonderful.
From somebody who I think the conference will be great for your platform. But there was also a question of, are you including bathroom equipment in the discussion with CMS at T8 Para here? So I know the struggle with insurance.
Great. I can answer this quickly. No, not with CMS. It's a very interesting debate. Most health insurance companies, CMS and or private, do not cover shower chairs. I'm talking shower chairs with wheels that roll and tilt back for people with significant mobility impairments. I have hundreds of stories. However, somehow I have navigated within the private health insurance system, and I wrote a very long paper with nearly 50 peer-reviewed journal articles, and I got one approved. And I, in turn, sent my letter of medical necessity, take out my personal information, add your own. And now people seem to be getting approved. And it wasn't a magic formula. It was just, I was thinking methodically, because oftentimes general practitioners who have to write a letter of medical necessity, they write 3 to 4 sentences. Here's a patient, this is medically necessary, and there's no backstory and there's no hard facts or data. So that is what I've learned on being your own self-advocate, and I'm more than happy to share that with you. If you're more than, I'm sure Marcy and Valarie have my email address that they can pass along.
Right, thank you. Jeremy, you referenced the fact that DEI has become popular in the last few years, which seems to imply it's the latest trend. How do we make sure the conversation continues in a meaningful way? And can you be specific and concrete for those of us not part of the disabled world?
Well, you know, it's vital that this stays and doesn't become a flash in the pan. You know, the evidence, I suspect, will demonstrate that this is. I mean, the evidence is clear. All the data you read and all the papers you read about DEI refer to this, that there's a direct benefit, a fiscal benefit even, to more diverse companies. So it's very important that we don't backslide on this one. But what is more important is that we are, let's say, more robust about making sure that the disability element of diversity is also incorporated. Because here's the thing. In my country, for instance, we made a bit of a mistake in that we focused on employment alone. We don't have an overarching disability law like you Americans do with the ADA. We just literally don't have one. What we have is a very equitable labor law called the Employment Equity Act, which explicitly says you need to employ more persons with disabilities. The problem with that is that it only focuses on labor. It has no jurisdiction outside of the workplace. And so it has no control over things that impact one's ability to get into the workplace: public transport, education, standards of living, access to consumer organizations like shops and insurance companies, etc. All those things impact one's ability to, in fact, find work. And so it's DEI must make sure that it isn't only an employment issue. So it's really important to make sure that DEI represents the consumer. And that's where, as Mark very clearly pointed out, that's also where disability has a very strong hand to raise and say, we are here we buy stuff, we buy houses. Even blind guys buy cars. We may not drive them, but we do buy them. And so we are consumers. So the DEI narrative needs to ensure disability is included, because it would be a catastrophic oversight. And I suspect that way DEI will fail if it doesn't, in fact, learn to embrace disability.
Jeremy, you reminded me of that scene in that movie, A Sin of a Woman, where Al Pacino, who was blind, decided he wanted to drive.
Yeah.
So here's a more general question of how do Rotaractors and younger members address the range of diverse issues associated with disability? And that's open to any of you.
Valarie, can I? Oh, sorry, Marcy, can I have a shot at that?
Sure.
And I'm sorry if I'm jumping in here with Mark and Valarie being the veteran Rotarians. But one of the ways is, and there's something I've noticed, is that it's not like Rotary doesn't do stuff for disability. Rotary does. The polio eradication proved that. So there's a lot of initiatives, there's a lot of projects which incorporate the issue of disability. What we're saying is inclusion doesn't mean that you do great projects for disability. Inclusion means that you get closer to those projects. So I met a club here. I spoke for another district, a district just north of me, 9400, at the end of the Rotary year in June. And somebody came up to me and said, my club has distributed 40,000 wheelchairs in 20 years. I looked at him and I said, that's wonderful, really wonderful. But what do you know about the people sitting in those wheelchairs? How safe are those wheelchairs? What is the status of those people? Do you know what their employment is? Do you know what they do? Do you know what their education status is? Are they involved in any way in your clubs? How many members do you have from the people you put in those chairs? And that's how we can encourage Rotaractors. Not everybody can be a Rotarian automatically. There are issues. We know about dues and things, but that doesn't mean that all people with disabilities are poor. But you can certainly assume that many people with disabilities are underemployed and under-resourced financially, which means there are opportunities from a Rotaract and Interact point of view. And instead of doing stuff for people with disabilities, we need to find ways to incorporate those people with disabilities into our club environments as potential members, as Rotaractors, Interactors, so that they get a feel for the family of Rotary and begin to participate.
And Jeremy,
yes.
to add to that as well, you reminded me with with a wheelchair story. It speaks to the famous late advocate Stella Young. She did a really beautiful YouTube. I'm sorry, it was on YouTube, but it was a TED Talk on inspiration porn.
Yeah.
Excuse my language, but
Yeah.
I did not coin that term, right?
Yeah.
Helping
Yeah.
people with
No,
disabilities.
I love the term too.
It is helping people with disabilities because it either makes you feel better or just assuming we're inspirational and wonderful just because we have a disability. Most
Yeah.
of us with disabilities have a skill set, have something to offer the community, and we happen to have a disability as well.
Yeah, yeah, exactly right. I read your paper on disability porn as well.
Yeah.
So this is an interesting question. Is the word disabled stigmatized in and of itself, and therefore has negative connotations?
This is Allie
Look.
here. I would love to add to that quickly, Mark, if you don't mind. It's very interesting. I had this conversation. I work for a global organization and we work in many different countries. And there's a lot of cultural differences as well. Person first, language first. It depends where you are. In the United States, a lot of people prefer persons with a disability. In England, it's disabled. So it depends what model you're working on. So when in doubt, just ask. How would you like to be referred to as? Mark? No, you had some comments.
Yeah, I think this is a great question, and thank you, Ali, for that, because it's a personal thing. I'm deaf. I'm disabled. For me, that's empowering. It doesn't identify me, but it's important to me. But some people prefer person-first language, so they prefer a person with a disability. I'm a person with a disability. I don't like that. I don't personally like that. So as Ali says, always ask. But the word disability and the word disabled is not a bad word. It's a real word. It's a good word. I embrace it. But people who are not disabled are quite often afraid to use it. Don't be afraid. Use it. The stigma is perpetuated by the fact that we're afraid to use that word. Use it, and use it often. Just one little statistic that I actually forgot to give you, and I'd like to give it to you because we're coming to the end of this meeting. And I talked to you about the fact that 1 in 5 around the world have a disability. 1 in 5. Now, 1 in 5, 18% of the population have a disability. And there's some of you who are on this podcast tonight or this webinar who would actually say, I can afford to ignore that. I can dismiss that. That's really not that big. Well, think of it this way. If you take that 18% of people around the world with disability and you add in the direct family member, mom, dad, brother, sister, son, daughter, you're now at 70% of the world population. So that's the number none of us can afford to ignore. And that's the number I want you to take home tonight. That's the number I want you to think about when you go back to your Rotary Club and think, I'm not looking at 70% of my community. It's important.
Yep.
So there are more questions and there are tons of comments. I have just asked Chris if he would save the chat because there's some things really worth reviewing in there, but we are at 6:59 and I know Valarie has a couple of wrap-up comments. So I'll turn it back to you, Valarie.
Thanks so much, Marcy. And thank you for the active participation in the chat box. And we will endeavor to maybe ask Ali, Jeremy, and Mark to draft some comments back and we'll to the questions we didn't get to, and we'll provide those back to Marcy and her team, because don't want to ignore everything that we didn't get a chance to, because this was really great conversation. And we know that, you know, our efforts to improve DEI are critical to the future of Rotary. And we know, as been mentioned tonight, that the data from the private sector, and we spent a lot of time talking about the private sector, and how it relates to Rotary, but it consistently demonstrates that companies that prioritize an open, welcoming environment for everyone are more highly regarded and more profitable. And we spent some time talking about that. To grow Rotary and become a more dynamic organization, we must take DEI seriously. And thanks to all of you for being here and participating in our DEI survey from Rotary International, for going to the online learning center, for having DEI as one of your zone's breakout sessions, and for all of you attending. We're doing just that. So Marcy has asked me to share with you that a short evaluation that will take you about 2 minutes to complete will be sent to each of you tomorrow morning, along with the recording of the session. So again, I just want to thank you all for being here, and it's been our pleasure to present to you and have this wonderful conversation with you this evening.